So when you're talking war films that talk about mental illness, it's good to point out the ones that get it right, but it's also good to call out the ones that get it really, really wrong. Today, I'm going to just go through a list of films and very quickly tell you why their depiction of mental illness is either sketchy, horrible, or wildly inaccurate. Um, these are my 11 for 11 dishonorable mentions.
Welcome to Shattered the Podcast.
Sharing the lived experience of mental illness on
A father,
A mother.
A family.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go!
Let's go.
probably the worst word in the military is dishonorable. To have a dishonorable discharge is a massive thing. So for me to be listing a bunch of movies today and calling them dishonorable is me really trying to put the boot into films that pretended that they were more than they weren't. Okay. So let's talk about this first film. And I have to talk about it. Let's forget about any kind of depiction of mental illness in the Green Berets. There's none. And I use this one first because the war in Vietnam happened in Southeast Asia, happened in Vietnam, which is typically a hot country. Probably one of my biggest gripes with the Green Berets, starring John Wayne, is the fact that nobody ever sweats the whole time they're in Vietnam. Never once. And of course, in John Wayne's depiction, not only is he like 60 years old, running around in the jungle like a 19, trying to run around the jungle like a 19-year-old, apparently when you watch it, the Americans won the Vietnam War. It was a resounding victory. So that's my first dishonorable mention. Okay, let's talk about film number 2. And this one has always been a controversial film because the filmmaker of Apocalypse Now says that he served in Vietnam, and I have no reason to disbelieve that. I watch Apocalypse Now with huge amount of skepticism because it's a psychedelic film made in the 60s, 70s that depicts one veteran's version of the Vietnam War. Now, I've watched this film with both my father and my grandfather, who both served in Vietnam. Neither one of them saw anything that actually or came close to resembling the truth of their Vietnam War experience. Now, of course, the experience of Australian soldiers versus American soldiers was very, very different. I don't honestly believe that the filmmaker here is trying to say that this is how Vietnam was. Helicopters flying Playboy bunnies into combat zones. Men with their own private armies going mental. There's just so many things in here that you couldn't even come close to reality. I would imagine that this is what this guy thinks the war felt like. Now, an interesting sidebar to this film is if you watch the making of documentary, the one that his wife shot, you can see that the actors and the studio and the director were not just fighting um, to get a film made, they were fighting the elements, they were fighting disaster. So a lot of their feelings of bitterness and I guess frustration found their way into the film, becoming film fact. Again, I would say that this is this guy's interpretation of what the Vietnam War felt like. Vast majority of veterans would not recognize their tour in this film um, in any way, shape, or form, let alone its inaccurate depiction of a guy deep in the jungle going crazy. forming his own kingdom. It's weird. There is a parallel. There was an Australian soldier um, who was with the Montagnards up north in the highlands, not in the swamps, who was very effective. And the regular Australian army was very, very nervous about his effectiveness. And they kind of did a bit of a apocalypse now type scenario on him. They pulled him out because they thought he was making his own kingdom. But let's face it, most veterans of the Vietnam War are not going to recognize what they see in this film. And to talk about it as a film that depicts mental illness is an insult to anybody that has either served or has a mental illness. It's just, and I don't even feel like I need to go into the ways why it's bad. I think it's just self-evident. Okie doke, the next film. Now, this one caused controversy from day one, somewhat like Apocalypse Now. And you kind of feel like that this is what the director was going for. It depicts a veteran of the Vietnam War coming home and basically descending into a kind of madness where he kills a bunch of people, murders them. Then in the end, we find out that he was fantasizing, and the only person he did kill was like a serial killer. So he became a hero. The depictions in this film of a man coming home from war and being so disassociated from society that he becomes a serial killer is a trope that is one that is offensive, but it's also wrong. You know, I mean, it's one thing to be offended because, oh, I'm offended. Oh, my stars. But it's another thing when somebody takes your mental illness and stigmatizes an entire group of people over the actions or the supposed imaginary actions of this taxi driver. Where were the films about the veterans who came home, had families, struggled with alcoholism, struggled with PTSD, but lived their lives successfully in the real world? They didn't become serial killers. They didn't drive around fantasizing about killing people. They came home and they lived their lives as best they can. That is my problem with this film. Of course, it's got the most famous, you looking at me kind of line, which is probably the only good thing about this whole film. Yeah, dishonorable mention all the way. Our fourth and final dishonorable mention is Born on the 4th of July. Now, you would think in a film where Tom Cruise doesn't have legs, they wouldn't show him running, because in every film he does, he's always running somewhere and he runs weird. Have a look at it. Just Tom Cruise running. It's just weird. Now, Born in the 4th of July tried to do a creditable job of charting the return of a soldier from the Vietnam War who became a anti-war protester. And this is a true story for a minority of soldiers that fought in the war. Now let's talk about the fact that if this was based on a real guy, I have no idea that the series of events, although exaggerated, did happen to someone. But let's talk about the hundreds of thousands of veterans who suffered and then came home, the same as we saw in Taxi Driver. This depiction that these veterans came home and were so warped by their experiences that they could never live a normal life. And yes, that did happen. Let's not pretend that it didn't. And yes, there were injustices that happened after the Vietnam War. My father was taken to an RSL club, a Returned Servicemen's League club. He's been kind enough to tell this story on Shattered, where his best mate and he had just come home from Vietnam. Their father, who was a World War II veteran, invited them to come down to the RSL club to meet other veterans to show off his veteran son. A beautiful thing for a father to do, only to have other World War II veterans say that he wasn't a real veteran. He didn't actually serve in a war, and they derided his service. The gentleman was disgusted, and please listen to my interview with my dad when he talks about this story, how hard it was. And yes, that was a typical experience after the war. But let's be clear. My dad came home from the war, had 4 kids, wasn't an alcoholic, wasn't abusive, didn't terrorize us. Came home. His war experience was his war experience. It happened. Thankfully, he was in a non-combatant role. But let's face it, in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, there were no safe places to be. He saw the real face of war. I believe that every soldier that served on the ground in Vietnam saw the real face of the war because they didn't know where the lines began and where they ended. But let's stop characterizing these returned Vietnam veterans. And I mean, look in every film that depicts a veteran coming home, the Manchurian Candidate, that the one, Dirty Harry, the sniper. This idea that these guys came home and were broken, but were broken to the extent where they wanted to hurt other people. Now, it is a fact that a person with a mental illness is far more likely, infinitely more likely to hurt themselves rather than hurt another person. That is the depiction of in these films particularly that I despise. And I'm not offended like, oh, my stars. As I said, I'm offended because how dare they take the living pain of men and women that serve their countries with honor and stigmatize them in this way. Dishonorable mentions all the way. We are 2 days away from the 11th of the 11th. So tomorrow is going to be the final movie review. And I have saved this review because it's a really important one. It's for a film called Regeneration. And it talks about how mental illness was treated in World War I, particularly shell shock. It's an incredible film. And that's why I wanted to get the dishonorable mentions out the way, because tomorrow's is going to be so good. That has been Dishonorable Mentions. This has been Movies and Mental Illness on STP. I will talk to you again tomorrow. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Shattered the podcast. I'd like to thank our producer, Meredith Brosnan, our executive producer, Torian Lau, and the band Adelaide for allowing us to use their song as our theme. Go to shatteredthepodcast.com for more information.